So basically, once you create the log, how do you do is you have to go and apart from logging, you can write specific information to the log. Like suppose you want to check the value of some variable, so you can write it to the debug class. All of you must be using this, right? So you'll use the system.debug and you can see the statements in the debug log. So if you select the debug log and select only debug only, so you will see only the debug statements. So basically system.debug is used to write to specifically write to log. Apart from what Salesforce is automatically logging, you can specifically write using system.debug to log. Okay. So here to have a quick look over here, so you have to go to developer console, or you can also look at the debug log from application. So if you write a statement, like say like let's execute this. If I execute this, there are some system.debug statements in that. And if I go to my log, now this is the overall debug log, okay. But if you want to see the debug statement, you can select the debug only, and here it will tell you. Here basically what is happening in this code, I am trying to debug the exception. An exception is getting generated, so that is what I am printing. So basically, this is the overall log. So you see it logs everything, and if you want to see only debug statements, you can select debug. Okay, moving on to the next question. So you can explicitly write to from Apex. Next is what is exception and how it is handled in Apex. Now everybody knows, all of you are from a programming background, and since you already done the developer course and going for an interview, I assume you all know what is an exception. Exception is an error which happens, which disrupts the normal flow of code, right? So that is what is an exception. What are exception statements? There are two ways. Throw statement, you can generate exceptions, or you can use try catch finally to gracefully recover from an exception. Like say for example here, so this is a typical try catch exception block. So here what will happen is if any error happens, it will go into the exception block. So this is handling the exception. Otherwise what will happen is if you don't give exception, if you don't give even though there is an error, what is happening if I execute this? See what happens over here. Even though there is an exception, this does not throw the error on the screen. It handles it gracefully. Now suppose I don't handle this exception. See what will happen. Now if I execute this, see, it throws on the user screen. So this is unhandled one. So that is why you have to always handle exceptions. So interviewer may ask you, if don't handle exception, why should you handle exception when there is automatically logging happening, correct? An exception default will happen. So but that is not the correct way. It's not the correct user experience. You have to use the try catch exception, handle it gracefully, so that user doesn't get crazy errors on the screen. So best practice, always you write try catch, always, okay. Remember, this is always. You do not write anything, any code, any SOQLs or anything without managing the exception. You can also use system.debug to check the exception. Now again, this is a typical try catch finally block. So try and catch is the exception, and finally is the default block, which is an optional one. So remember, there's a trick question. Interview will say, suppose exception doesn't happen, will finally run? Yes, finally will always run whether there is an exception or not. Okay, this is a typical try catch block. Now if you don't handle exception, see, now suppose you last I showed you from the anonymous block. Now the user is entering some information over here. Now if you don't handle the exception, see what a bad error message is coming up, right? So review all, error message, apex trigger. It's like for the end user, suppose he's sitting in the bank branch and using your CRM application. How will he understand attempt to dereference and all of it? He's not a technical person, right? So you have to always handle exceptions and give the correct error messages so that the users can. One typical example is, in your Android phone, suddenly there will be a crash. So that's not a good experience, right? So you need to handle exceptions gracefully. Now, interviewer may ask you, give me an exception handling example. Okay. So let's take a look at an exception example over here. Now here what is happening, you have created an instance of an object, merchandise M, and you are inserting M. This will immediately throw a DML exception because you have not initialized any fields. Okay, so this insert will cause a DML exception because we have not given any field. So this is an example that you can give.